And you know, she was just holding on to me, and she was shaking, and she was sobbing.
I can shut my eyes and see everything as if it's a moviola replaying itself. I can remember going to the window of the apartment, and there was a liquor store right beneath the apartment. And I can remember the woman, the proprietor, the owner of the liquor store, coming out into the street with her hands up in the air, shrieking, someone shot the president.
I was on the shuttle getting off on 42nd in Lexington. I remember as soon as I got off the subway, people were talking, you know, standing around and so on. And what did you think? I was stunned. I forget where I was going, but, you know, it makes me think of 9/11. You know, you just, what do? You just, I did whatever I had to do, but it changes everything, obviously.
All right, that was part of Tom Brokaw's upcoming NBC special, Where Were You the Day JFK Died, airing tonight on NBC at 9 p.m., 8 Central. We're going to talk to Tom in the next hour about that. Now a live look at the eternal flame as well as we mark the day. And here with us now on the set here in Washington, D.C., columnist for Bloomberg View, Al Hunt. Al, your thoughts 50 years later?
Well, it's a day that none of us will ever forget who lived through it. I was a junior at Wake Forest, and I had just spent 2 days interviewing James Reston, the great columnist for the New York Times, and I was supposed to go see him for the third day. I was a UPI stringer and also with a college newspaper. The night before, he'd said, "Young man, I'm going to give you some advice. Go into journalism and marry above yourself." And I did both. But I was going to see him for the final interview and walking across the campus, and the news came on the radio, and I just remember the total complete disbelief, the shock, and people crying, and it's the one day of my life that I, you know, other than my marriage, that I'll never forget.
Yeah.
I also think that the inspiration. I was in my family, Michael. I grew up with a very Republican family, yep. And I fell in love with John F. Kennedy during the 1960 campaign. He was young, he was different, he was inspirational, he was everything you wanted politics to be. And for whatever the latter-day critics are, that remains today. And I still think he was one of the most inspirational presidents we've ever had.
Well, we're going to take a look at some uninspirational things now happening in Washington, and that would be the nuclear option. That
promising a solemn and respectful tribute to the memory of President Kennedy. The weather is not exactly cooperating. It is cold. Temperatures maybe in the low 40s. It's windy right now. We may get rain later, but the city of Dallas is promising that this ceremony will go on. Scheduled to begin about 12:15 Texas time. It will include prayers, as well as music, speeches, and tributes to the late President Kennedy. The city is aware that the eyes of the world, to a large extent, are on Dallas today. We're seeing, of course, a lot of national news media, but also media outlets from a number of different foreign countries. Among the highlights of the ceremony, noted historian David McCullough will be on hand here on stage to read excerpts from a number of President Kennedy's most famous speeches as the city of Dallas takes a moment today to remember the tragic events of 50 years ago. Steve?
All right. Dan Godwin reporting live from Dealey Plaza 50 years later. Dan, thank you. Elizabeth.
50 years later, today, we remember John F. Kennedy, a man with a vision taken too soon in a death that still captivates the country half a century later. Now to the solemn remembrances around the nation today as America marks 50 years since President Kennedy was killed.
And for the first time ever, the assassination being remembered at Dealey Plaza in Dallas, where the president was shot. ABC's Brandy Hitt is there.
John F. Kennedy was more than President of the United States.
What we must be concerned about always, of course, is the future.
Excitement surrounded the young, handsome leader and his glamorous family. But that all changed on November 22nd, 1963.
As Mrs. Kennedy now gets into the car, and the president does,
when thousands gathered in Dallas to watch the president and First Lady's motorcade.
There's the president and Mrs. Kennedy just minutes before he was shot.
The president was shot twice with his wife Jackie next to him.
She did scream. She says, "My God, he's been hit."
The president was hit in the head.
The president fell over face down.
And Dr. Ronald Jones rushed to Parkland Hospital.
There was no sign of life, in my opinion. He had a fixed stare. His eyes were open.
As word spread of Kennedy's assassination, shock and sadness paralyzed the nation.
The whole country was just absolutely mesmerized and horrified by it.
Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was quickly sworn into office as the focus assassin Oswald. And Oswald's murder on live television left behind even more questions.
A lone gunman's just crazy, and that's so unsatisfying. And so people like to go after conspiracy theories because they seem so much more rational.
Now, 50 years later, the country gathers again to remember Kennedy, and the moment time seemed to stand still at Dealey Plaza. As part of the ceremonies, a moment of silence will be held at exactly 12:30 in the afternoon Central Time, the moment President Kennedy was shot. Brandy Hitt, ABC News, Dallas.
And stay with ABC News for today's events. Remembering John F. Kennedy will carry the moment of commemoration at 1:25 p.m. Eastern.
A future in which our country will match its military strength with our moral restraint, its wealth with our wisdom, its power with our purpose.
Well, Lee Harvey Oswald immediately became the prime suspect in the Kennedy and Tippit murders. The police were zeroing in on a person they suspected of being his accomplice, Buell Frazier.
Did they ask you about driving him to work that morning?
Yes.
Did they ask you about the package that he had with him?
Yes.
Frazier was interrogated for more than 12 hours. Even the head of homicide, Captain Will Fritz, got into the act.
He wanted me to sign papers that I was confessing to being part of that, and that I knew of it, I had knowledge of it, that it was going to happen and all like that, and I told him I wouldn't sign that, because I told him it wasn't the truth.
By now, Ruth Payne and Marita Oswald knew the president was dead, but they had no idea that Marina's husband had shot him. Then they heard a knock at the door.
And several police officers showed up and said they had Lee Oswald in custody for shooting an officer. One of them asked, did Lee have a gun? And translated to Marina. And she said, yes, he did, and led them into the garage where there was a blanket roll, and she thought that the gun was in there. She had seen it there. The police officer picked up the blanket roll, and it folded over his arm. And I realized that there had been a gun, and it was gone. And he came out that night as he never had on a weeknight before, and probably got the gun. And it was at that point that I thought it could have been Lee.
That was part of Tom Brokaw's upcoming NBC special, Where Were You the Day JFK Died, airing tonight at 9 p.m., 8 p.m. Central on NBC. And with us now in New York, NBC's Tom Brokaw, along with managing editor and host of Dan Rather Reports on Access TV, Dan Rather. And here in Washington, former White House Special Assistant to the Counselor, Frank Gannon. Tom Brokaw, I would like to hand this segment over to you. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Mika. Well, this is a unique situation because Dan and I are on the same side of the table. We've competed against each other, always on friendly terms all these years. Dan was in Dallas that day, obviously, and as we were watching Buell Frazier and the other friends of Lee Harvey Oswald, I was struck at the time that we did the interview, Dan, by how many people were directly affected by this assassination, and it changed their lives. Buell Frazier, a poor country boy, drives Lee Harvey Oswald to work. For the rest of his life, he's identified as a friend of the man who shot the president, and he effectively says his life was ruined.
Well, and you can believe it, because there are people still alive who maintain that he should be a suspect in the assassination itself. It did directly affect Ruth Payne, whom I interviewed very shortly after the assassination, the weekend or the days following. Her life has been extremely complicated, but when you have a cataclysmic event such as this, an emotional earthquake, as I've called it, certainly there are some people right in the center of it whose lives are going to be affected for the rest of their time.
You were there. You were with CBS, running the Dallas Bureau at the time, charged with picking up the film, which you had in those days get to a transmission point. But for you, that really was the beginning of the CBS career in a way. I mean, you had been on the air, but that was a seminal moment.
Well, that's fair to say that I was covering the civil rights movement and Dr. Martin Luther King as my first assignment, but I was I'd only been at CBS about a year and 3/4 when this happened, and that's fair to say that when you cover something such as this, something that sticks in the national memory, in a career sense, I don't like to speak of it in those terms, but what you just described, that's true.
I was a young reporter in Omaha, and we were dark. We didn't have the network up during the noon hour. So I read it on the air in Omaha 2 or 3 times, and then ran out to the Strategic Air Command headquarters to see what was going on. Couldn't get near the place. Went back downtown. Midwestern governors were meeting, and the spokesman was George Romney, who was Mitt Romney's father. And of course, no one could project ahead at that time. I don't think any of us had an idea how this would linger and affect the country. I want to bring in now Frank Gannon, who is my friend and a speechwriter for Richard Nixon as well. But on that weekend, he was looking forward to playing the piano for President Kennedy. He had done that on the Sequoia earlier. He was the president of the Georgetown student body. Frank, how did you find out that the president had been shot and your engagement would go away?
Whenever I was going to play for a party on the Sequoia on the weekend, I worked at a college in 1789, and I was a bartender during the week, and I played the piano on the weekends. And there were other bartenders, but there was only one piano player. So if the party were going to be on a weekend, Red Fay's office would call me. My discoverer and patron and the host of these parties was Red Fay, who was one of President Kennedy's oldest friends. Kennedy had taught him at P.T.'s boat school in Rhode Island in the summer of '42, and they had been friendly ever since. And when Kennedy was elected, he appointed Red as Undersecretary of the Navy. So I got a call at the beginning of that week from Red's office saying that the president was coming back from Texas on Saturday, and if he wasn't too tired when he got back, there would be a party that night because the Sequoia was going to go into dry dock, so the next window of opportunity wouldn't be until the spring. So that afternoon, I was at a class. I was an undergraduate at Georgetown. And I at the Foreign Service School, and I was walking back to the Foreign Service School campus, and as I went into 36th Street, I saw 50, 70 people in the middle of the street in front of the Foreign Service School building. And as I got closer, it was a white, well, it's memorable to most people where they were. It was a white Buick Skylark convertible, top down. It was a mild day, and a girl called Tony Hughes was driving it. And she had stopped and her radio was up, and people were gathered around. And as I got to the edge of the crowd, someone said the president had been shot. So I went into the bar there, and there was or to the diner, and there was a television, well, they were all black and white in those days, but a black and white television above the counter, and that's when I heard that he was dead.
You know, Dan and I had different experiences with Richard Nixon than you did. You ended up working for him. No one, I think, has been in the unique position that you were to play the piano for President Kennedy and at the same time to go to San Clemente when the president resigned the presidency. Tell us about the difference in the two men. There had been so much speculation. Here they'd been at the same war, they'd been in Congress at the same time, and then they ran against each other. Give us your take on the difference between Richard Nixon, how he found out about the assassination, and John F. Kennedy.
Well, politics and piano playing make strange bedfellows, so I guess I'm a case in point of that. They came to Congress together in 1947. Nixon said they were bookends on the Labor and Education Committee because they were, as the juniorist members, they were at opposite ends of the committee dais. And they debated the Taft-Hartley bill a couple of times as bright young members. In 1950, John Kennedy, Congressman Kennedy, brought a $1,000 contribution from his father, Joe Kennedy, to the Nixon Senate campaign against Helga Hagen Douglas. In '52, Nixon sponsored the new Senator Kennedy for membership of the Burning Tree Club. The Nixons were invited to the Kennedy wedding in '53. In '59, in '59, President Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, told his close friend, journalist Charlie Bartlett, that if the Democrats didn't nominate him, Kennedy, in 1960, he would vote for Nixon. All of that ended and went south with the '60 campaign, which was a searing experience for Nixon. It was the, arguably, it's the prototype of the, or the paradigm of modern campaigning, but Nixon was sideswiped by the Kennedy machine. 8 years later, Hubert Humphrey, the most optimistic of humans, described it in his memoirs. The memoirs were many years later, but he described the '68 campaign, and he said that beneath the beautiful surface, there was an element of ruthlessness and toughness that he would never forget.
Dan, do you think that this story will so endure that 50 years from now, there will be other former anchors sitting at this desk talking about the impact of the assassination of John F. Kennedy on not just the American political scene, but on the cultural scene as well?
I do believe that will happen, Tom. Not at the level it's happened for this first 50th anniversary, but I think it will be because the Kennedy mystique, partly because he died violently so young, also because he had so much promise. I think the mystique will be there 50 years from now, and yes, there'll probably be aging anchormen talking about it.
Well, we're not going to put ourselves in that category, Mika, and certainly I wouldn't put you in that category.
No, you're definitely not in that category, gentlemen. In fact, you ought to do a show together. That was great. Where were you the day JFK died? Airs on NBC tonight at 9 p.m., 8 p.m. Central. It's incredible. Tom Brokaw, thank you. Dan Rather, always good to see you. Thank you very much. And Frank Gannon, thank you as well. Up next, newly released.
It has become known as the unspoken speech, the address President John F. Kennedy was supposed to give in Dallas 50 years ago today. Of course, it was a complicated time. Dallas, a complicated city where JFK found himself faced with a political firestorm, one, of course, that he never got out of.
I have in front of me a copy of the speech which President Kennedy was to deliver at noon today. If I may, I should like to read this speech, which was not delivered.
He arrived 50 years ago today in Dallas, a city divided.
He essentially came to try to settle a political fight that was breaking out among Democrats between the conservative branch of the Democratic Party, led by Governor Connolly, who was in the car, and the liberal wing. And he really came down to try to heal that rift.
Crowds lined the streets, among them a small but vocal group of right-wing extremists furious at the president's politics.
In many ways, people down in the South perceived him as just another extension of Yankee power coming down from the North, telling people what to do.
The Dallas Morning News had been especially harsh, endorsing Nixon in 1960 by warning Kennedy would usher in a welfare state and Marxist socialism. Letters to the editor called him the puppet of Pope John and a socialist pickpocket. A harshly critical full-page ad greeted the president to the city that morning. Upon seeing it, the president fatefully told his wife, "We're heading into nut country today, but Jackie, if somebody wanted to shoot me from a window with a rifle, nobody can stop it, so why worry about it?" There was reason for concern. Less than a month earlier, UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson was confronted by an angry mob.
Surely, my dear friend, I don't have to come here from Illinois to teach Texas manners, do I?
President Kennedy never would give that speech in Dallas.
It is true that our president, Governor Connolly, and Lord King have been shot.
Instead, NBC's Chet Huntley read the speech to the entire country.
That we may achieve in our time, and for all time, the ancient vision of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. That must always be our goal, and the righteousness of our cause must always underlie our strength. For, as was written long ago, except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. That is the speech which President Kennedy was to deliver at approximately noon today, but he was cut down en route to the Trademark.
Before you go, Dad, I just wonder your thoughts on that moment in history, and also just where were you at the time? At Columbia?
I was at Columbia University in the faculty club when the waiter came up to me as I was having lunch and said, "I hear the president was shot." I remember I just leapt up, stood up, straight up, and then I rushed down, looked at television, waited until the moment when Cronkite said to the country, there's a rumor, I repeat, there's a rumor that the president's dead. And I shared the grief of so many. I think what the president was saying was absolutely historically innovative. Till then, atomic bombs were viewed as the principal instrument of foreign policy, ultimately. I think we moved into an age subsequent to it, but not long afterwards, in which we came to recognize that atomic weapons were essentially standoff weapons. They can create a paralysis, a standoff, but they're not weapons you want to use when other countries have them also, because that means then collective suicide. And I think we're now in that phase, and incidentally what we talked about earlier is very relevant to that. We want to have a system in which there's deterrence. Some countries have them, alas, but in a way that creates balance. And you want to have a system in which everyone else refrains from having them.
All right, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, thank you. We'll be right back.